everyone. This is Taylor Barnes from United States of Women here, and I'm really excited to be here today with Alicia Sanchez-Gill of YWCA.
Hi folks, Alicia Sanchez-Gill here. I'm the Director of Research and Program Evaluation here at YWCA, and I'm so excited to host y'all here in our office.
We're happy to be here because, as many of you guys know, tomorrow is Women's Equality Day. Woo! Some great, some not so much. And we're here to do some real talk about the 19th Amendment, who that left out, some of the history of the suffragist movement, and really talk about how some action steps and things we can all do to push for progress for all women.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So first of all, we'll just kick it off with a real talk history of the 19th Amendment. Obviously, 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote, but at the time it did not include women of color in a lot of different areas.
Yep. So let's take it back to 1920,
yes.
And I feel like the historian here. So,
we got our notes. We're
right,
like
we
on
got notes.
news.
We got tons of data if you want it. I want to say that women of color were habitually and intentionally left out of the suffrage movement initially.
Right. Yeah, there was definitely a decision, especially, far before, but especially in 1913, that it was easier to just get the white women the right to vote, and that it was important to just focus on that.
So I want to talk about some particular historical events that occurred. So the first women's suffrage movement here in Washington, D.C. in 1913, that was the first suffrage parade, if you will, encouraged black women to march at the back of the march.
Yeah, it was either, they said that it was either black women and white women march separately, with white women in the front, black women in the back, or there's no march at all.
Yeah, Alice Paul was super concerned that if black women and white women marched together, that we would kind of upset social norms, upset voters, upset white women, and that they wouldn't show up.
That's right. So that happened. That's a real thing. It was separate, but there were, as happens time and time again, there were still awesome women of color showing up to do the work.
Absolutely. So I think about the leadership of I.W. Wells, who was like, actually, psych, I'm going to march in the front.
That's right.
The women of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, who also marched in the original suffrage march. Yeah, so there were women of color leading change and pushing for transformation right at the intersections of race and gender from the very beginning. For as long as there's been oppression, there's been resistance.
That's right, and showing up when white women told them not to.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think about also the National Association of Colored Women, the Dorothy Height and the National Council of Negro Women, of course.
And I almost want to shout out Dorothy Height right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, please.
And just be totally honest, in doing research for this Facebook Live, I had heard her name before, but didn't really realize, and when I was doing research for this, I was like, holy crap, this is just another example of how history can really be erased, and that, I never learned about her in school. Not that that's on my school system. I was glad that I learned a little bit more, and we actually have an awesome article. Jody, if we can share that Dorothy Height article, we'll share it with you in the comments. You can read a little bit more about her story.
Absolutely. She was the president of the National Council of Negro Women. She was also the racial justice leader here at YWCA USA, and an executive of YWCA for many, many years. So her work is incredibly dear to my heart personally. I actually was reading about her this morning too, and got emotional thinking about all of her leadership in the face of consistent anti-blackness and racism.
That's right. Yeah. And is she the reason why? She's really one of the people that made your racial justice mission so critical to equality. Because I really have, in working with you guys, I'm always admiring how both, your USA chapters, but then all of the local chapters that we have the privilege to work with really have racial justice at their core.
Absolutely, right. So if you go to any YWCA across the country, we might be doing different work. We're the largest provider of domestic violence services in the country. Many of our local associations are providing child care and just meeting and early childhood education and really meeting the needs in their community. But we share the commitment to racial justice in all of the work that we do, and it's not programmatic. It's really a value center for our work. And so Dorothy Height was really the trailblazer of what we call the One Imperative, which said that our mission was to eliminate racism wherever it existed and by any means necessary. And so we've really carried that banner forward with our mission to eliminate racism and empower women today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Damn right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's super exciting.
Yeah. And so, sorry, we got a good sidetrack on history there.
Yeah.
But bringing us back to 1920, obviously the 19th Amendment passes, but then there are, I want to say obviously 65 or 45 years, but really it still persists today, and that there were consistent attacks on the women of color's right to vote from many different ways, from tests in many of the southern states. Also, Native Americans were not considered citizens at that point, even though they were born here. And obviously, around World War II, there were huge attacks on Asian Americans' women's right to vote as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So many women of color were disenfranchised in the opportunity to vote, from language tests, literacy tests, taxation, poll taxes as they were called, but also like things like KKK intimidation.
That's right.
So there was actual physical intimidation that prevented folks from having the right to vote or actually utilizing that right.
Yeah, and one stat that I pulled from this is that obviously we didn't touch on this initial, but the 15th Amendment was what guaranteed black men the right to vote, but they have really been through their own source of text that 4,000 black men were lynched between 1877 and 1950. So that really, you're totally right about the KKK style intimidations and the lynch mobs and things that are a very real part of our voting history in this country.
And Ida B. Wells did amazing anti-lynching work in addition to advocating for black women's right and women of color in particular, and just the intersections of race and gender and our right to vote, to actually have the vote.
That's right. Busy lady. You can't just put one thing after what she did. There's like a list.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's the thing about intersectionality, right? Is it doesn't stop at women's rights.
Yeah, that's right.
Because what women? Which ones?
Which ones is a very important question. And actually, the next link I want to share with you guys is Bust Magazine. Bust Magazine has a great article on some of the history behind the racism that was in the women's suffrage movement. It's funny. I know you guys all know that feature Facebook timeline where it's like, you did this 3 years ago. 3 years ago, I was definitely like, woo, rights for all women. And I am glad that the internet's a horrible and amazing place. There's a lot of resources online, and I was glad to read about this. So if you want to go ahead and share that article in the comments, that'd be awesome. We have our handy sidekicks, Jody and Tiffany here, helping us make the comments possible. So if you do have questions, things you want to throw out, we do have folks here with us, so you can let us know.
And they'll just read them out loud to us.
Read them out loud
with your name.
In a good way.
In a good way.
In a good way. So this kind of gets. Are you ready to go into action steps, or are there more things you kind of want to mention on the history? There's a lot of history.
There's a lot of history, and so there are like a couple of things I want to acknowledge. Right, that Asian Americans weren't even considered, allowed to be considered citizens until 1952. 1952.
Not too long.
Not that long ago. That's right. Just one generation.
That's what sticks with me. Is this isn't hundreds and hundreds of years.
This is not ancient history. This is just in our grandparents, or even our parents, some of us, our parents' time, right? Native Americans were barred from voting in many states until 1957, and black folks in particular, black American folks, were the very last to gain the right to vote. So that's really important. And it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Yes. That's right.
So that's 45 years after the 19th Amendment, right?
And that's a generation.
Yeah.
So I think that's what is really actually almost two. So it's that we're really being realistic about how far that set certain women.
Yeah. And also it wasn't until 1975 that there were even bilingual and Spanish speaking polls and voting ballots, right? So we have this history is so close to us. And it's not history yet, unfortunately.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And this really gets us into one thing we want to talk about today is voting rights. Is that this, if hearing about how the 19th Amendment only helps someone makes you a little bit uncomfortable and feel some kind of way, let's channel that and focus on voting rights, because I think that they're, this doesn't have to be hostile or complicated. We can really talk about the real history and how we can all work to fix that.
Yeah.
So I just want to do some real talk about voting rights. Obviously, this struggle against disenfranchisement is still really very much going on. One resource I just want to throw out right away that I'll kind of take through right now is the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law has awesome resources on this. And as I was kind of figuring out, okay, wait, how many states have actually passed some of these laws? So in 2017, we kind of know that the state legislative calendars are set. We know what states are getting into. There have been 99 bills to restrict access to registration, voting registration, in 31 states. So 35 of these bills saw significant legislative action, which means they're moving forward. And that they've at least been approved in 17 different states. So I think that's really important that many states are imposing voting restrictions.
Absolutely.
And 5 states, I want to call it 5 states that have already enacted rules to make it harder to vote. So if you live in one of these states, or live next to them, or know someone that lives in them, I want to really encourage you to kind of think about what you can do on a state level for this. So Iowa, Arkansas, North Dakota, Indiana, Montana, and Georgia have all made some pretty serious strides in that. And Jody, if you can share that article from the Brennan Center, I definitely encourage you to dig into this. The article that we're going to share is great. It has a lot of different things you can dig into. But the voting rights are a really important thing that is seeing significant action right now, 2017, across the country.
Yeah, and even as they're trying to really push back some of the Voting Rights Act. Folks are saying that in North Carolina in particular that they targeted African Americans with disenfranchisement with surgical precision, right? So they're very clear and intentional about restricting access to the right to vote.
That's right. Yeah. So it's not, I think it's again really important just to be honest about the intention behind some of these bills. And what you can do about it. So, like we said, if you live in one of those states, get involved. But if you don't, there's a lot of great ways you can take action. I want to, again, shout out the Brennan Center for Justice. I also want to draw everyone's attention to the Advancement Project. They're a national group that has a right to vote campaign, and they push for the universal right to vote. So basically what that means is, we have to work to get registered to vote. There are many countries that either have mandatory voting or you're just automatically added to the rolls when you get your driver's license or do any number of times when you kind of interact with the government that, we're making it easy for people.
Right. Not harder.
Not harder. And one thing I didn't mention, but obviously, is early voting and multiple voting locations. I was lucky enough to work on a campaign in Florida, and I sort of saw this firsthand in that, Florida had 2 weeks of early voting. That obviously shrank in this election cycle, and that, we just really need to be paying attention to how accessible we're making voting to people who work, people who don't have set schedules. I mean, I think I can barely drop off my dry cleaning and do other things, let alone everyone's busy after work no matter what you do.
Right.
Yeah.
And I want to also say that there have been some recent redistricting of polling places too, so making it harder for people to actually physically get there, right? So having extra time, longer term early voting really helps with that process. So that it's actually physically accessible for folks.
That's right.
Yeah.
So find out where your state stands on that.
Yeah.
Really important.
Right.
And just, be paying attention. I think that's one thing that it's obviously, tough to balance. Paying attention to the news, self-care. I know it's something everyone struggles with. But this is a good thing to try and pay attention to. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a question.
Yes.
She's put on the spot. Let's talk about white women's role in the Voting Rights Act. I'm going to put you on the spot with this.
No, that's good.
Let's talk about white women's role in complicity, but even further than that, really their actual role, their hand in disenfranchising women of color.
That's right.
Let's talk about that.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
And I think this really ties into what white women did during the first right to vote, but then we can also tie to what we need to be doing now.
Yeah, and what we did just months ago.
That's right. That's right. Still burns me a little bit. But I think so. Obviously, we were talking about this before the Facebook Live feed started up, but that there was obviously Susan B. Anthony, one of the most famous leaders of the suffragette movement said that she would rather cut off her arm rather than give the Negro the right to vote. So that kind of language around, I think it's really important just to be honest about that. White women during the 1920s and before really, chose themselves, and they kind of shrunk the tent and made it small tent, instead of really focusing on equality for all women, and maybe fighting the quote unquote harder fight that might have perceived as been harder to win, but really a real win. I want to say,
right. And I mean, I think that white women saw Black women's need and right to vote and full humanity, right, as not only a distraction to their work, right?
I'm glad you brought up that language.
An impediment to their work, a distraction to their work, but also that like our needs and our desires around voting could potentially be at odds with their own needs.
That's right.
Yeah, and the needs of their own families.
That's right. And I think I'm glad that you really brought up like this distraction language, because I think we still see that today.
Absolutely.
With just women in the feminist movement in general, not really centering the narratives of women of color and just saying, wait, I don't think what you're saying is right. I'm not hearing you. And again, using that distraction language that. And I think that's like a kind of complicated thing, that it's like white women continuing to own like what's a real problem versus like what's a distraction.
Absolutely. And I want to be really clear that centering the voices of women of color is not a distraction.
That's right.
We say all the time, right, trust Black women, and it's because Black women and women of color and Indigenous and Native women will really lead us to the kind of liberation and like full humanity that we need.
That's right.
Right? If we only center some women's voices, there's a whole lot of communities and concerns and needs and vision that gets left out of the narrative.
That's right. And I think there's a lot of different ways to center women of color narratives and voice in your own life, because even in, I don't want this to sound trite, but I think like we're all on social media a lot. We're all consuming a lot of different forms of news. Like, make sure you follow diverse groups on Twitter. I personally absolutely love Brittany Packnett's feed. Absolutely love Feminista Jones' feed. Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's a love fest over here for her. But I think really being intentional about who you get news from, and making sure you have those. Even watching these amazing women of color process current events has helped me sort of figure out how to approach my friends of color about this. I know that when Charlottesville happened, and the barrage of like horrible things that all of the police violence shootings that have happened. I think if it were me a few years ago, I would have, and I know I did this, would always be like, hey, can you please help me understand this? Can you tell me about XYZ? And I want to just talk about the emotional labor and the emotional baggage that Black women do, and all women of color for a lot of white women. And I think one thing this is something I've really been reading about lately, is that if we want to be, if white women, in the face of Charlottesville, in the face of any number of things that are happening, want to be allies, co-conspirators, helpful, it's not relying on your friends of color to look things up for you. It's not saying, what should I read? Or the internet,
or teach me how to help you.
And one thing that that people just on my timeline have been saying is like, racism is not a black women problem. This is a white problem. I think it's really clear to be to talk about how racism and this structural racism is created and perpetuated by white people, and there's a lot to be done on our end. And the good news on this is that the internet is actually a great place for this.
Absolutely. So Google is your friend.
Google's your friend. I literally, when I was researching this, I have Googled things white people can do. A ton comes up in a good way. So
and read like work that's by people of color. That's too, right. So rely on the vast resources. That's when I think about the history of feminism and queer rights movements, right? It's like queer folks of color, queer and trans folks of color, women of color, who have really we've given you a framework, right? Like we've really been the architects.
It's already done.
Yeah, we're the architects, right? So it's there. Yeah. It's there for you to research.
It is, and I think you don't have to. Like you said, you don't have to go far to find excellent writing by women of color about these issues. Yep. Really, just Google it and it comes up. And I want to share one article on our Facebook feed right now that's Everyday Feminism has an awesome list of resources for people that are really trying to learn about this. And I want to also say, perfect is the enemy of the good. I think we live in a time where it can be really tough to speak up, or really tough to, you know, either talk to your relatives, or just say like, hey, I care about this. And I think that it's really important to just start reading, start somewhere, and I think that can really help inform how to move forward, and how to move forward together, really, because I think I've been happy in at least, I think that there's in reading about the history, it's not great, and I think it's like, you can be like, oh, this is like a shiny city on a hill I used to have, of like the suffragettes and all this great things. History's always a little bit more complicated than that.
Absolutely.
It always requires a little bit of digging to learn about things that you didn't learn in school, that were, you know, kept off the curriculums potentially for a reason. To do that research and really kind of keep that going, so that we can inform the work this time around. I think something I've been reading is that, you know, if you wondered how you would be in the civil rights movement, like, congratulations, you're living in it right now.
Right, absolutely.
So, like, we are in a new civil rights movement, and it's really important to not repeat some of the mistakes that my ancestors made.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you brought up, too, talking to family and friends, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a really amazing book called The Revolution Starts at Home, right? And so remind yourselves, right, that the revolution, 53% of white women voted for 45, right? And so it's really important just to remind yourselves to, like, also be talking to your family and friends.
That's right.
And, like, the folks closest to you.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of current events that really make that kind of conversation top of mind in homes. You know, I think even tomorrow, when everyone is, you know, going to be talking about Women's Equality Day, it's definitely like a natural time to bring up, I was reading about Women's Equality Day, and there's a ton of barriers that were put in place that I didn't know about. You know, I think that family conversation doesn't necessarily have to start hostile.
Absolutely.
And I think one line that I kind of read afterwards was like, wow, that's really not how I feel. I'm sorry you feel that way. That there are things you can say to your family members that don't start, you know, World War III at Thanksgiving. However, that's important too. But that there are a lot of different ways to approach it with your own family members.
Yeah, and also remembering too that your brief discomfort with family is like nothing compared to the education, how important the education is, and how those folks will show up in the world as they interact with folks of color.
That's right.
Right.
That's
right.
A little bit of uncomfortability is worth sort of mitigating the harm and the pain that both, you know, me or my family members could, you know, impart on people of color.
Absolutely.
Because it is uncomfortable. It's
I imagine.
So I know that I, like, in reading about this stuff, it's always like, oh,
I hear this a lot.
Crap. Like, no, it's more, it's not even that I hear this a lot, it's just like, this is, so it's depressing, but I think, you know, move from that place of discomfort to a place of action, because the time is now, and, you know, from voting rights to listening to women of color, there's a bunch of stuff we can all do this Women's Equality Day to do better this time around.
Absolutely. And to, like, remember the history, but also notice how it shows up today. So really be paying attention.
Notice the patterns, and be ready to break those patterns down and get after the justice.
And get out on the streets if you need to, right?
Yes. Or show up when you need. There's a lot.
We don't have to be on the streets. But
a lot of things.
Yeah, there's so many ways to show up for women of color.
There are.
Yeah.
Do you have any parting thoughts? This has been so great.
Yeah, this is so fun. We always have a really good time together.
Yeah. We've gotten to do some Facebook Live before, but I was behind the scenes for that one, so I'm super glad I could be here with you for this one.
Thank
you for all the emotional labor you have done, all of your work, because I think that it's really important to recognize that.
Great.
And for being a leader and a visionary.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So I will leave with this just final parting thought, which is that Black women have always been in the forefront of movements, of making voting rights more equitable, education more equitable. They are the architects of movements, right? And so trust leadership of women of color, and listen, and be good listeners.
That's right. I'm going to let Alicia have the last word on that one.
Yeah. There it is.
Happy Women's Equality Day, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.